Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring new ways to connect people, places, and things everywhere. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Stefan. Hey, Mauricio.
Hi, Taylor. How's it hanging?
By a thread. I'm just getting back from a camping trip, and I'm getting my brain back into work mode. But I was stoked because I finally saw Starlink satellites. Have you seen those?
Yeah, in fact, there is one on a building near our headquarters, and I think that was the first time I've actually seen one deployed here in downtown Boise.
Well, I'm talking about the chains in the sky, when you camp. Those are wild to see because it's literally just a bunch of really bright circles following each other closely and perfectly. And I just couldn't help but think if you were living in one of those off-the-grid tribes and you looked up and you saw that, I would feel you might consider that the world is ending or there's some crazy thing happening. And the first Starlink satellites launched in May 2019, only about 60 of them. And today there's estimated to be more than 6,000.
Yeah, I have a story for another time about what happened when a tribe, off-the-grid tribe, was giving internet access. But like I said, that's a story for another time. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Satellite internet has definitely been a technology that's been out there for a while, but usually it used to be characterized by low speeds, high latency. It was definitely, it still kind of is a connection of last resort, but that last resort was really last resort. And not to say that any of those providers didn't try and make that experience as good as it could be, but the technology just wasn't quite there yet. And so now today, those low Earth orbit connectivity providers, or generically as they're being referred to now as non-terrestrial connections, have definitely stepped up to the point where they're becoming viable connectivity sources, especially in areas where even cellular is not available. Because places extremely remote places like Western Australia, and even some of the desert regions here in the U.S., the rainforests of South America, obviously they're not going to, cellular carriers are not going to go through the expense of putting in towers and connectivity there. And just the physics of RF just means it doesn't have the reach. And so, the quality of connection of a satellite provider is pretty much all that is the option in those places.
Yeah. And, like you said, when these satellites first hit the scene, it was really a perfect solution for people that were living and traveling to highly remote locations, especially for safety reasons. But now we're seeing more and more enterprise businesses look to those low orbit satellites to bolster their WAN architecture, still in rural locations, but a lot of times in emergency use cases as well. And in fact, I just saw that Cradlepoint announced that it's enabling in-vehicle 5G and satellite connectivity for a company called SA Power Networks. And they're the sole electricity distributor in South Australia. And ultimately, by using satellite as one of their WAN connections, they can improve SLAs in their trucks, and the router prioritizes the best performing link. And so it's just one example of how businesses can capitalize on these satellite WAN connections. And today we have two guests with us to talk about satellite as WAN and how they fit alongside the cellular story. From SimpleCom, please welcome VP of Sales Tom Cain. And joining us from Ericsson is Technical Marketing Engineer Tyler Peterson. Well, Tyler, Tom, welcome. Thank you for joining us to talk about satellite WAN. And satellite can really mean many things and conjure up a lot of images in our heads. So I'd like to start by just level setting what we're talking about here. So Tyler, can you tell us a little bit about what a low orbit satellite is and how it kind of differs from other satellites?
Sure. Yeah, there are two primary types of satellites in use right now. General classifications are going to be geosynchronous orbit-based satellites, and then, of course, the low Earth orbit satellites that you talked about. The difference is in the way that they work is that the low Earth orbit satellites will communicate between one another. The reason that that's important is, as an example, if you've got a receiver on the ground that's communicating with satellite is in turn bouncing that down to the ground station. When that low Earth orbit satellite passes beyond the supported area that the beam can reach, it needs to hand that connection off to the next satellite behind it because they're constantly in motion. Whereas with geosynchronous satellites, the receivers can be totally static and they stay within the range of that service beam from the satellite itself and maintain connectivity back to the base station that way. So it really is one of the major technical issues that needed to be overcome back in the early 90s for connectivity to be viable via satellite the way that we're doing it now.
And then a lot of people really started adopting, I mean, I won't say a lot, I think it's maybe been a slow burn a little bit, but adopting this satellite connectivity. I think we saw it a lot in remote areas to begin with, but now we're seeing it, Mauricio and I were just discussing, we're seeing it so much in enterprise business, growing at least. So I'd love to hear from you guys, like, why is that? Like, what are some of the benefits of using satellite if you're a business?
Sure. Dom, do you want to start us off on that, or shall I jump in?
I'll piggyback right off of you. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, great. So really, the things you need to consider there, why people are digging into it right now, is there's one major company that I think we're all familiar with that's driving a lot of that popularity right now. But honestly, satellite connectivity is something that Cradlepoint has been connected to since I started with them back in 2013. So some of the things that you're going to need to keep in mind with why enterprise is moving over to satellite connectivity now is that there are three major considerations. It's going to be cost, infrastructure, and of course, coverage. So the coverage is better now than it's ever been. It used to be that with companies like Geosat or TaxSat, they were using geosynchronous orbit style satellites. And so they were very, very limited in where they could move to. So that is one of the major considerations to keep in mind. If even with a low Earth orbit, if you move outside of a coverage area, you're going to have some problem, whether it's through obfuscation or some other problems that we can talk about later. But the drive from enterprise is really about ubiquitous connectivity and the availability and the dropping cost of it. So with the coverage capabilities out there right now, you can really attain true global coverage with some of the low Earth orbit satellite capabilities that are out there these days and the services that are being delivered across that. We've seen that become very, very popular with a lot of our first responder customers that often need to respond to emergencies beyond the reach of the cell tower. So having that ubiquity of global coverage really is the major driver that I have personally seen around that. The other limitations might be just the geography itself. Even if you are technically within the realm of a cell tower within the range, there might be some other obfuscations that are going on, buildings in the way between you and the receiver, heavy foliage, those sorts of things. So having a direct line of sight to the sky and getting connectivity that way is a major advantage in some of those environments.
No, great points, Tyler. I definitely agree with all those. The part that I've seen in the last few years and why people are moving over to satellite and considering it, particularly in enterprise, is that for years they thought that, cellular was probably a little more failover or tertiary, really couldn't be a primary connection for anybody. And now we see the carriers are changing that with the likes of 5G and MIMO technology, even the C-band that's out there. So people are moving over, but they still want diversity. And while the carriers are quick to bring a lot of these services out there, sometimes you only can find one that have that in the area. So to have that diversity, have that capability of being that true fiber in the air, they have to look at different points of entry. And seeing now the LEO services and obviously some of those companies that are really popular out there, people have been exploring. And with that exploration, the costs are no longer in the comma circuits, they're being driven down. So while cellular is really driving it down, satellite services are really affordable. So when you look at those things, I think that's one of the areas that really have been changing folks' minds. The other part about it is having the capability of having more reliability and resiliency in the network as they do SD-WAN. Traditionally they're going with fiber connections or coax connections or a bonding connection of both of those things. These days in SD-WAN solutions, they want to have that diversity. So not only just having the failover and maybe tertiary services, want to create that capability of shaping traffic through it. And it creates a nice way of being able to do that for our customers that we've seen.
Absolutely. Totally concur. The other element on top of that is SD-WAN is
is becoming table stakes in just about everything that we do at Cradlepoint, because there's several different ways that we approach that. But the capability to bond and aggregate all of those links together from a route layer is, again, pointing right to the diversity of WAN resources that you'd mentioned. Used to be that everybody was going to broadband rather than MPLS circuits. And then that transition started to happen. I really see satellite as the next sort of branch in the evolution of that digital transformation.
Yeah, bringing it back into the cities.
It's an excellent point that you made too about the wire connection, right? Is people are looking for true diversity, and just because you have multiple wires, that doesn't necessarily make it a diverse connection, right? Because a lot of times those wires are going back to the same demarc point, and so that becomes a single point of failure, right? And if you do only have one wireless carrier available, you have to look for alternative means, especially if your use case is mobile or remote. There is only one carrier available, so having that carrier diversity means looking for something alternative like non-terrestrial WAN sources.
Absolutely. And to Mauricio's point, it goes beyond failure, right? I mean, having a terminal failure because somebody's got a backhoe virus in their network is problematic on its own. But now we're talking about being able to deliver the quality of services across those multiple links if some of them might be underperforming due to various problems, right? Whether it's signaling or oversubscription. Some of those still translate over to the satellite connectivity, but that diversity really is key for a lot of the customer experience that's being demanded by the applications of the enterprise these days.
Even as adoption is growing for satellite, especially like you were saying, being able to use it as a different WAN link, and whether that's through bonding or failover or whatever the case is, are there still some misconceptions or drawbacks to using satellite, or is it really just like benefits? I mean, are there things that people should watch out for, or maybe just like some flim-flam to debunk?
Yeah, I'll quickly take it, and then of course Tyler's going to go into the more technical portions of it. But I'm going to tell you, there are some times where there are some disconnections of the service, and while as a consumer, you may not see that. Everyone knows that when you're downloading a movie, it usually gets ahead of time. If you've ever been on a plane, you see how that kind of service works, and then all of a sudden it was out. Those services, they do have some points where they're trying to connect, and then there's a little portion where there may not be some connection. It happens from time to time. If you look at cellular services, it's more like a Tarzan, where if Tarzan swinging through on a vine and it goes to grab another vine, it holds that securely before it lets go and it keeps on going. That's why we have a great cellular network as it went from 2G to 3G and that wider bubble came out. You have that more overlap. That's what some of these new LEO services are doing, as opposed to MEO services, the medium Earth orbit stuff that was out there. So we're having more services are out there. So you make sure that you have to get a very good service that's launching a lot of these satellites out there. But the other things is regulatory things that are going to make challenges on whether or not you can actually put those services out there. Of course, you're going to work with those local services, whether or not you can get that, but there will be some challenges from time to time. And then, of course, even though you're remote, you still have to get power and other things like that. So you have to think about those things and how will this work if you're going to utilize this on maybe a solar condition or something when it goes down and you have no power, or long-term, how do you want to do those things? So there are some challenges and some potential drawbacks. The other thing is, of course, as we know, cellular is a little bit less expensive than these things and have more of a capability of using unlimited services that we see 5G and no longer have a metered, where a lot of these new LEO services, as they're progressing through, certainly have a metered service. So you're paying for what you utilizing that. Tyler, from a technical standpoint, I'd imagine you have a couple of points of contention as well.
Points of contention. Very nice segue. Yeah, contention is one of the major problems that you got to consider. Contention meaning what your performance looks like according to the consumption of the subscriptions in your service area. So we've all seen cellular congestion happen during rush hour, as an example. With satellite, it's exactly the same thing. The service area of the beam that's coming down from those satellites as they pass overhead or as they're focused on your region from a geosynchronous perspective, there's only so much bandwidth that those frequencies can carry and that those satellites can translate back to the ground stations. Now, that's a substantial amount of traffic, but it's still susceptible to some of the contention issues you might run into with signaling and some other things. Anecdotally, I think one of the major things that we need to consider is that what the word mobile actually means. So talked about what a satellite is early on in the conversation, but we have to consider what is mobile. So anecdotally, doing some validation testing on our own network using our R1900 dual modem router in a vehicle, we put a mobile high-performance dishy from Starlink on top of a vehicle, and it worked fantastic. We were pulling pretty close to what they were stating at 100 megabits per second. We were really averaging out at about 92 to 95 megabits per second, all the way up to about 40 miles an hour, which was great, right? But anything above that, when we started to get into freeway speeds, 65, 70 miles an hour, that performance ramped down extremely quickly to the point that it disconnected just because it could not track appropriately to connect to the satellite. The other problem there is physical. The dishy, the receiver for that setup, is quite large. So being on the top of a car at 70 miles an hour, well, sometimes they might tend to act like a wing. So we had a little bit of a problem with one of those things flying off of a test vehicle. Fortunately, the vendor, or the manufacturer rather, was kind enough to give us a one-time replacement on it. But the physical dimension of satellite is something that needs to be taken into consideration, especially when we're talking about in-vehicle networking. It has to be stationary to get the full performance capability out of those satellite links. And the point that Tom brought up, power consumption, is a serious concern. We're talking about consuming enough power where a 120 volt system inside a home in an AC circuit is required in order to make this thing operate. So running it on a 9 to 12 to 24 volt system in a vehicle just isn't feasible. You have to have a supplementary battery source inside that vehicle to power those satellite receivers because they're beaming a long way. It's going 350 to 750 miles above us. And there's a lot of opportunity for that signal to have some problems unless it's powered sufficiently.
You know, Tyler, you describing that the equipment at high speed and I'm like a Final Destination kid, and all I could picture was the log truck scene. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. And so that was just all I was thinking of when you said that. So now that I've gotten over that, what you're talking about, I think, is a good segue for, as an enterprise business, whether it's a mobile use case or an on-site use case. Can we dive a little bit into like what is actually needed for these solutions to integrate with one another? I mean, obviously like a cellular router, and then when we say a satellite solution, like what is the hardware that's needed? How do businesses start to put these things together?
Yeah, sure. So from the actual satellite component, if you just took, for example, a Starlink, there's many out there that are competitive to those, but most of them have a dish itself, and those dishes vary. You're going to want to make sure you know exactly how you're going to use it, whether you're going to use it mobile, you're going to use it marine, or you're going to use this fixed inside a location. People in RVs have been using these for quite a few years now, right? So you want to get the right types of equipment in there. There's various types of mounts for them, et cetera. And now even so much so that, you know, they're changing, particularly Starlink has changed their model a few times now over to make sure that they're optimizing the best way to do these things. So of course you need the actual unit itself, and you want some sort of stable mounting conditions for what you're actually putting it on. Then you need the connection that goes all the way down back to what generally is a modem that they provide on there, or sometimes it goes directly right into what will be your edge device, your smart router, and that could be many things. Obviously, you know, we like to manage it off something with a cloud-based solution like Cradlepoint. Makes a lot of sense for us. Seeing that these days right now, currently, something like Starlink doesn't have that kind of cloud-based solution, that great reach-out system on there. We utilize and supplement a Cradlepoint in there. So from that standpoint, a couple of different pieces that go in there. You buy it as a kit together, as you know, from the Leo services on there. You subscribe to the service. So you find, you know, someone that can subscribe you to those services and get you the proper services. There are business and residential. There's mobile as well as fixed. So you want to make sure you have someone that's an expert in that, getting you the right thing so you're not overpaying. And the other thing is you want to make sure that you have enough services from a standpoint of usage. You don't want to be in a situation where you're paying overage. Everyone remember those days from the cellular days when you were paying for over on minutes and it got crazy, and then it was text messages and it was all these other things. It's the same way now. There's still a consumption-based model. So you're going to need some of those components that are in there. If you have a really advanced solution where you need to go in through a roof, what have you, I highly suggest utilizing a certified and trained partner in those as well.
Yeah, absolutely spot on, Tom. I totally agree. From the cradle point perspective, it's pretty simple because once the satellite required equipment is deployed appropriately and is connected, it's just an Ethernet connection to us. So we can manage that connection either from the NetCloud operating system in the router itself, or through NetCloud Manager, we can get it connected to the NCX SASE solution and SD-WAN options in order to do some of the packet magic that we can do with intelligent bonding and traffic steering and policy application and advanced web security and so on. So it's pretty straightforward from that perspective. There are varying degrees of those deployments that we can get into. Again, Cradlepoint has always been very highly oriented around a co-deployment mentality, where we never say no when we've got a connection that's available to us, whether it's a Wi-Fi as WAN option or multiple different carriers available in our software-defined modem software, and even the Ethernet and WAN and LAN switchable ports kind of tell that story. So as long as we can see standardized protocols moving across at the appropriate packet size, we can make use of that WAN resource and apply those traffic steering and traffic health monitoring tools to it. And that said, there is a depth of equipment that you need to consider for these deployments as well. So we've talked a lot about Starlink because it's very, very popular, but you do require their router and their power source in order to drive their receiver, unless you're willing to do some pretty serious modification to the cabling that comes with it. Part of the problem that we're having right now is that for these highly commercialized, sort of consumer-oriented solutions that are out there like Starlink, the level of accessory attainment is pretty low. There's not a lot of stuff out there that's built to help it work with other stuff. It's pretty proprietary and it's built that way. So in my own deployments, that's one of the problems that I had to overcome. It's not really that big of a deal to include the other required equipment from whatever vendor you're dealing with. But it is something that you need to take into consideration from a logistics perspective, because it can throw some wrinkles, especially in in-vehicle deployments or in power-starved environments like the one that Tom brought up. If you're running something on solar and you've only got so much power capability within a given time frame, that's really some of the things that you need to keep in mind. But as far as extra equipment on the Cradlepoint perspective, we really don't need anything else other than that satellite receiver and its whatever modem router configuration they require.
Tom, I want to touch back on something you said, because it actually, brought up something from my past. Is kind of funny. It's you mentioned that RVers have been using this for a while, and I kind of find it hilarious because from the cellular mobile aspect, that was kind of what pioneered cellular mobile connectivity in vehicles as well, too, is like the RVers and long-haul truckers tend to be ingenuitive to taking a solution that solves a problem and, applying it maybe not necessarily where the manufacturer thought it was going to be applied, right? So I find it kind of, what's the best word? I find it kind of, interesting that kind of some of the aspects or the challenges that both you and Tyler brought up for satellite connectivity do kind of mirror the challenges in the early days of cellular. And when I say early days, probably 3G was when cellular connectivity really started to become more prevalent in vehicles for more limited, low use case, low data use cases. But I think that that's probably a place that kind of creates some issues for satellite providers. Is at least in the early days of cellular, nobody expected it to be high throughput use cases. But now satellite providers are having contents with the already kind of established expectations that they've got from using LTE and in vehicles, LTE and 5G in vehicles, and they're having to play a little bit of a catch up a lot faster because they have to overcome maybe some unreasonable expectations. And I don't want to call it a burgeoning technology because, satellite connectivity has been around for quite a bit of time. It hasn't been, I think, some of the newer vendors in the space and even some of the legacy vendors in the space have done a lot to improve the functionality of satellite, but it still definitely has some places to catch up like you've mentioned. And so I think a common theme I've been pulling through all of our podcasts is the right solution to solve the problem, right? And not trying to force fit something where it doesn't fit, right? And not saying that satellite isn't a good fit for certain use cases, but it really is about making sure that this is the right fit and couching those expectations onto what the technology can actually do.
Absolutely. No technology is a panacea, right? It all lives in the tension between functionality and usability and security. We're all familiar with the CIA triad and what we need to consider there. But with considering satellite connectivity for an enterprise, they really need to consider the environment that it's going into, because some of the problems that you may have with either a LEO-based or a geosynchronous orbit-based connectivity solution is that obscuring that signal base, that RF base that's operating between the receiver and the satellite, if you don't have a line of sight to the sky, you're going to have connectivity issues. So the signaling performance looks different than it does in satellite. But some of those problems in that tension look pretty similar from a performance perspective. Things that I was surprised by when I first got involved with connectivity using cellular and satellite WAN connectivity through the Cradlepoint routers is even heavy smoke, the particulate in the air, can disrupt that satellite connectivity. You guys may remember a few years ago the Camp Complex fire in Southern California, or Central California, I guess. That was a severe fire. It was devastating. But the particulate that was in the air actually disrupted the satellite connectivity that was being leveraged through a Cradlepoint router at the Cal Fire and at the U.S. Forest Service response teams' fire camps. And they needed to fail back to multiple carriers on cellular. Unfortunately, it didn't create a problem. They had seamless connectivity the entire time. But even inclement weather and atmospheric conditions can heavily influence the way that you're going to be able to use that connectivity. So keep in mind where it's going to go and whether or not.
Yeah, I know when I had a Sunday ticket on a certain satellite provider. I know when the bad weather happened, it really would create problems for me.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I think that is driving people to look at satellite as well as cellular as well as terrestrial and not cut everything, the cords, is they're looking for diversity. So if that the Sunday ticket, as you just described on there, was available in multiple different ways and multiple different streams that was coming in the internet, and you have the capacity of just keeping that stream going regardless, particularly in the background, without even worrying about how it was actually coming in, but you're consuming it. There's plenty of people that would go ahead and pay that extra money to say, hey, I want this experience to be seamless for myself. And then there's others out there that say, you know what, I only need this to work some of the time, and it doesn't need to work all the time. So again, going back to Tyler's point of, I always, form follows function, make sure that you're getting the right services for yourself, but it's certainly something to be considered. And when you bring it back to intelligent edges like Cradlepoint that are able to manage that for you, whether it's an SD-WAN environment or more in a bonding, emerging bonding technology, we're going to see more and more of this out there, particularly because of what you just mentioned. People are comfortable at home, having satellite dishes on their roofs. They want to say, okay, you know what? I've also had experiences where I'm out in the mountains and I have to only have, satellite internet for years. So this is not something brand new to anybody. It's just a matter of the promise of 5G is causing everyone to kind of move into other areas. How can I get more quicker, right? How can I develop that quicker? So the download consumption of 5G services being super fast is probably putting that, potentially unrealistic expectation out there, Mauricio. But I will say that, to meet that is going to be incumbent upon, folks like Cradlepoint, folks like ourselves and SimpleCom on how do we meet the need of the customer, what they're asking for, and the tools that we have at our fingertips now. And we'll talk probably a little more about that, what's happening in the future. It's going to be really exciting.
We've talked about some of the use cases for it. And, I think just at work myself, I've seen satellite WAN coupled mostly with stories of like emergency services and how they're maybe going in and out of rural areas and how that's beneficial to them. Tom, you and I chatted too that SimpleCom recently worked with Tampa General Hospital to implement satellite WAN into their mix. I'd be curious to hear about, maybe some of the challenges that they faced before they had that on board and why they decided to add satellite into the mix and what that looks like for them.
Yeah, sure. So TGH, as they're known locally there, if you guys don't know them, they're one of the most comprehensive medical facilities in West Central Florida. They literally serve dozens of counties. Population exceeds 4 million. So it's a very important location for a system, I should say, ecosystem for the citizens there, doing a fantastic job. But they also serve as a communication center for all the emergency services. You have police, you have fire, you have EMS. All the comms are located in that facility. So at the top floor of that, you have all the comms there. So they have to, have 5 nines. They have to be up all the time. And up till now, they have very traditional infrastructure there, but they have some challenges with traditional infrastructure. As we know, we talked about wireline services, that last mile, as Mauricio pointed out earlier, having a single point of failure at some of these areas. Even if they have diversity coming into the building, there's challenges all that are in there. So they really want that resiliency plan that was out there, and they talked to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. The use cases aren't always about heroic efforts and saving lives. I mean, there's a lot of gravitas that comes along with that conversation. But again, talking about the tension between usability and serviceability, one of the things that we've seen that surprised me was a lot of nautical applications. So I worked with a dredge company out of the southern part of the United States that would contract their dredges all over the world. And so as a result, they would need to have some manner of eSIM or multiple SIMs that they could change around modems and do some different things. But with satellite connectivity, it is truly ubiquitous within the service areas of those satellite services. So they didn't have to worry about roaming contracts with carriers. They didn't have to worry about changing SIMs. They could standardize on what they were going to use the most so they could get the more bang out of their buck for their connectivity dollar with cellular. But they had the capability to go anywhere and still maintain connectivity for those critical management systems that needed to stay connected with the 5 nines connectivity reliance.
Yeah, that's so cool to hear about. I think we don't hear about that kind of use case enough. At least I personally don't. But the nautical application is interesting to me because this is something that really opens up a lot of avenues for them, I'm sure. And I'd be curious, Tom and Tyler, how do you guys see this relationship between cellular and satellite evolving as these technologies continue to mature? How do you think they might change or grow?
Well, if we go back to Tampa General for a little bit, just to talk about the architecture that was there, we did add satellite service to them. It was a Starlink in this particular case because it was the easiest for them to get involved in there. We also added 2 MIMO connections using the W4005 from Cradlepoint. So in conjunction with those two, so they already had a handful of fiber connections, 10 gig fiber connections already coming in, a handful of coaxial 1 gig connections coming in. So those they were utilizing those for a while. But again, emergency services are needed when emergency services are needed. So whether that be land or nautical or what have you, and being the services for the entire all the counties that are around that, the serving counties on there, they were like, okay, let's get this diversity in there. And at that point, whatever technology is available, we're going to deploy. And I see a lot of folks being not on just, the cutting edge, but sometimes on the bleeding edge of that, saying, no matter what, we're going to have to trial this for our citizens and make sure that we get the best services out there. It's exactly why you're seeing a lot of these, public safety entities moving to these and trialing these things, because there are either nothing available to them, or this is another avenue that they have redundancy capability in there. But where do I see the future going? I don't just see it just exploding in just the public sector, privatizing this and getting particularly in the enterprise space where we see, and so goes enterprise, so goes down the trickle effect all the way down to mid-price and all the way down, is the fact that these things are available, readily available. Of course, there's a finite amount in there, so that's why enterprise is going to invest in first. There's a little bit of upfront cost and investment on month-to-month, so it might not be so consumer grade where there's a consumer model of it, where you see sometimes that blended consumer over into business and business into consumer, really trying to define those lines. This one is really segmented into, this is a business grade solution that they're going to want to invest in, get the right services on. But the other part that I think is going in the future of this is the fact that we have the capability, particularly now, again, a little bit more bleeding, emerging, of the capabilities of something called bonding. And we kind of brushed on that. And that's just the idea of bringing multiple connections, not just an SD-WAN and saying where the traffic goes and how that packet data goes. It's literally creating a big fat pipe and taking all the services collectively into a big pipe and allowing those services to be utilized as such, where, otherwise you couldn't actually have that, whether it's redundancy, primary, tertiary, wherever that may be in their ecosystem from the need. I just feel like people are going to recognize the fact that we are not going to end consuming. We're just going to consume more and more, and everything's going cloud-based solution. And those things that we rely on are out there in the cloud. We need to be able to reach them, and we need to be able to reach them reliably. So that's what I think the future is.
Tom, I do have a question about just kind of mirroring the future outlook with the Tampa General use case. Have they, now that they have satellite implemented and they can see some of these benefits of some of the features like link bonding and bandwidth aggregation, those kinds of things, are there other things that they want to start using their network for, or is it just satellite is improving reliability and that's all we care about? Or are they saying, oh, and now maybe we can add on this technology because we have satellite in place? How is that future forecast looking for them?
Yeah, I think for the first time, you started seeing organizations like TGH and others that are implementing these type of solutions are, yes, first and foremost, check the box. We removed the single points of failure out of there. We added reliability, resiliency to our network. We're handling all those things in our ecosystem. But then it's exactly what you're saying. Where else can we utilize this? If we're already utilizing this for our police and fire and EMS, maybe we can put connections on closer to the edge for those folks where we're housing everything come back to us. So I think that's where they're going to start expanding that too. And people are saying, okay, if this is capable for this, then where's the other applications I could push this down into and start budgetizing and prioritizing that into their network ecosystem. Previous, a circuit had to be spun up. It could take 180 days or more. The cost of construction costs are just ever increasing. We all know those things. So I think that they're looking at where they put in their overall spend, where can they pull some of that budget back and reallocate to other areas. So while they may be saving over here on technology over here, it may actually help their citizens and their patients, in a location that has over 1,000 beds. Every dollar counts, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. The other thing you got to keep in mind, it's an ever expanding and evolving technology. And just like every other technology we've seen, there's going to be a path of efficiency and capability that increases with time as those investment costs start to build revenue. The overall ownership cost of these solutions is going to continue to go down, and that's going to drive greater integration. Much like we see with iPhones right now, having some geosynchronous capability just for an SOS outside of a coverage area, or if something happens to the infrastructure, so people can still get that emergency signal out. I think what's really kind of interesting is the cross-pollination of technology that's happening right now. There's been some tests out there leveraging 5G from satellite, which is very intriguing. And I really see that integration being something that Cradlepoint can make some pretty interesting capability with. If you consider the 5G platform and some of the standardization that the 3GPP group has put together, when we start talking about having not only multi-APN capability, which Cradlepoint has in their SIMs currently, but you cross-pollinate that with the eSIM capability, and then you cross-pollinate that with some of the different signaling capability that we've got with splitting signals out, band aggregation through the carriers. It's really going to create more avenues for efficiency in the transmission of that data, which is going to bring all of the costs of ownership down and increase the performance of that WAN connectivity across the board. So that I'm really looking forward to the next 3 to 5 years to see what that integration looks like. It's going to drive some pretty interesting changes for us.
It's fun to talk about this kind of stuff when it's, I don't want to say early, because like you guys said, it's not like satellite is new. It's not like LEO is brand new, but as this adoption starts to ramp up and as people see the ROI and that financial piece makes more sense to more companies, I think it's going to be fun to watch this grow. Tom and Tyler, we're really grateful that you guys made the time to chat with us today about satellite and how it can be incorporated with 5G and in all kinds of WAN connectivity. And before we let you go, Tom, can you tell our listeners a little bit about where they can find out more about SimpleCom?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Taylor. You can go to our website. It's simplecom.pro, simplecom.pro. Take a look over there. And then if you want to just reach out directly, you can always reach us at sales@simplecom.pro.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Taylor,
Mauricio.
for
Thank you,
having
Tom.
us. Thanks, Mauricio.
All right. So the three things that I think it was Tyler that mentioned at the beginning of this, when he was talking about satellite and the adoption, cost, infrastructure, coverage, right? Those are the three main things that people are talking about with satellite. And I don't know, a light bulb kind of went off for me like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a simple way to put it. That's what people are talking about with any sort of WAN technology, right? And so I think that as those things become more even-keeled and maybe match up a little bit closer to cellular, we'll see this adoption increase. But it's cool to hear that there are big enterprises that are already like, yep, we're hopping on this. We kind of don't have a choice, right? We'll do everything we can to make sure that our reliability is 100%.
Yeah, I think, we've said it a couple of times. Satellite is not a new technology. Even when it comes to satellite internet, there's people, there's companies that have been doing this a long time. They haven't had huge adoptions, but the kind of with Starlink and some of the others and low Earth orbit has kind of changed that a little bit. But with any new technology, the cost of entry is high, right? It typically referred to as the barrier of entry for a company to enter a market. But even for consumers to enter into a new technology, the cost is high. Think about, just about everything, relating it back to cellular. Think about, cell phones in general. The cost of that was high, and then smartphones, and then, hotspots, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until, that adoption reaches kind of that mass market kind of, that mass market adoption, does that start coming down? So yeah, I think right now you're kind of in that early adopter phase. If anybody's familiar with crossing the chasm, you're in that early adopter phase. So you either really need to have it or really want to have it in order to be willing to cost. But as that technology matures more, you're going to see the cost come down. You're going to see the infrastructure improve. And that's going to really drive that mass market adoption. But there are definite use cases out there, Tampa General being one of them, some other ones, especially in really remote areas that they fill into that have to have it. They don't have any other options. And, like we've discussed on other podcasts, connectivity is becoming more of a requirement and less of a luxury or nice to have. And so even in those rural areas, whether it's public safety or it's, other, public good kind of things like healthcare, they're really going to have that connectivity that drives those things. And so, there's going to have to be solutions to that, whether it's additional cellular infrastructure or it's satellite, LEO providers, or like Tyler mentioned, satellite is finding its way into cellular regulatory requirements like 3GPP, right? There's now this, as part of the latest 3GPP standard, there is 5G new radio non-terrestrial networks, and you're seeing carriers start to pilot those things. Like here in the U.S., one of the carriers is doing SMS messaging over that 5G non-terrestrial networks to, load data to start to kind of move in that direction. So I think you're going to start to see, that kind of real marriage between 5G and satellite becoming closer and closer to each other because there's such similar technologies.
Absolutely. If you guys enjoyed listening to this conversation about satellite and 5G connectivity, if it gave you some ideas or, just a good commute, share it with a friend. And then rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts.